1880s, Nelson was an abundant wilderness. It was the seasonal home of the Kootenai and the Lake Indians, providing fish and game. The philosophy of the mighty hunter showed respect for nature and her wildlife, and paralleled the nucleus of Webster's definition of sports, wherein opponents must be allowed fair play. Their survival was determined by their skills in hunting, fishing, archery, canoeing, mountaineering, horseback riding, and snowshoeing. We consider these activities survival sports. Thus, in honor of our true roots, and notwithstanding inadequate chronicling of this era of our history, our first entry into our Sports Hall of Fame is Narcisse, the first acknowledged mighty hunter by the newly forming white society. Unfortunately, swift economic gain was the primary focus of early Nelsonites. It was mostly prospectors who comprised the first influx, housing themselves in tents along the lake and at various claims scattered throughout the hills. Few sought community. They saw this land without a sense of permanence and were blind to the established Indian nation with its philosophy of respect for nature. In their search for the precious metals, they burned the hills bare. This caused pollution in the streams and lake and destruction to the fish and wildlife habitat. Soon the virgin forests that were not burned were logged, further expanding the ecological imbalance. With the aid of foreign investment capital from the East and the U.S., mining and logging camps sprang up and sawmills constructed, bringing the organization of labor and the first wage earners. This provided the first steady flow of money. Rail and steamship lines expanded, transporting out the abundant ore and lumber and transporting in supplies and laborers and our very first few families. Log houses and stores rose up amongst the tents. By this time, 1890, our first newspaper, The Miner, appeared. It was owned and edited by John Houston, who would become Nelson's first mayor in 1897. The local news was at first largely about mining. The first sports in town were the amusements of Baker Street and its bars, with bored and antsy miners and loggers hitting town with their hard-earned cash. Drinking and gambling blended well with cards. To play pool, it was necessary to go to the new hotel at Davenport Crossing. Baker Street was our first sports arena, providing the first competitions. Out on the street, rock drilling competitions were held as challenges between various mines. Horse races, organized or impromptu, often turned Baker Street into a dusty Wild West scene. Both sports provided ample opportunity for the thrill of betting without spectators or bettors losing their close proximity to the bars. One of the Miner's first sports reports in 1890 announced an upcoming bare-knuckle match with betting. Bare-knuckle boxing appears to have been our first contact sport, which presumed the strength and agility of a man to be synonymous with honor. Without regulation and going on until knockdown, it was both illegal and dangerous. Toward the end of the decade, these matches were held out on the lake aboard the now famous SS Moyie, out of easy access of the long arm of the law. Meanwhile, family life was increasing. In the past decade, Nelson had grown from a camp to a settlement and colony, and in the early 1890s was clearly making solid preparation for its founding as a city, which would occur in 1897. Small homesteads and farms were established, as well as the initial planting of orchards, starting the seed of an agrarian society which would eventually combine with the industrial base of this forming community. As a natural extension of the growth and expansion of family life, society developed, transplanting its European roots and Victorian ethics solidly in this soil. Social amusements and diversions through play are a natural social evolution, particularly the respected and well-known old country heritage team sports. In 1890, the first club is recorded as being formed. This was the Athletic and Glee Club, linking sports with culture. Education became a concern, and in 1892, the first school was built. By late 1893, our first fire hall was built, and on February 3, 1894, our fire boys held their first hose reel practice. By the end of the century, they would become the favorite sports team in town. In 1893, the first men's cultural club was formed, named the Nelson Club, and included amongst its cultural activities billiards and lawn bowling, which took place on the lawn outside the building. July 1st to 4th, 1890, gave us our first recorded full community gathering and celebration, Dominion Day, complete with 21 dynamite salute, horse races, foot races, local boating events, and a long-distance Nelson to Ainsworth boat race. In total, there were $400 worth of prizes. Families gathered in picnic groups at the lake. By the end of the century, this event would become Nelson's largest gathering, celebrating through sports and hosting thousands of guests, establishing Nelson as a tourist center. 1892 was also the year of the first attempt to form an amateur athletic association, recognizing the need for an umbrella sports organization for this now rapidly expanding community. Committees were formed for boating and rowing, baseball, football, cricket, and Dominion Day. These committees would eventually break away from this umbrella organization to form their own clubs. For these heritage sports, a place to gather and play had to be created. A recreation or sports ground was needed. This was accomplished for May Day, May 5, 1894. Work parties had been organized and the stumps had been cleared from the lot on the corner of Baker and Josephine. Now the foundation had been laid for team sports, which require a special place for regular games and practices with a large number of players. The Queen's birthday, May 24, 1893, was a celebration provided by the host community of Kaslo, which survived through floods, tornadoes, and fires, to remain the major host of this event through the turn of the century, and even now Nelsonites head up to Kaslo to celebrate this event with them. Every year, Nelson's people would board the SS Nelson and the SS Alberta on a celebration excursion to Kaslo as guests for the Queen's birthday events. Once loaded up and fired up, the ships would race to Kaslo. In its history of impromptu steamship racing, the Nelson usually won, at least until 1896, when the International and the Kokanee joined in. The latter soon embarrassed the Nelson by a time of a full 10 minutes. In 1895, yacht racing was added to the water events. July 1891 gave our children their first school picnic, complete with races and games. As the community grew, so did the number of churches and schools, increasing the number and size of picnic celebrations. These picnics were the center of organized children's sports. Steamship excursions up the lake to various points became very popular. By 1895, Squires Point was the scene of the annual Presbyterian Methodist picnic. By 1899, St. Saviour's Church was holding annual picnics. And by the end of the century, Kokanee, Captain Busk's home up the lake, was hosting large family and church picnic and sports gatherings. There were tennis courts, a soccer field, and an oval swimming pool provided children's diving and swimming competitions with prizes included. Weekends became a favorite time of gathering, and the lake was a natural playground. In fair weather, it provided a picnic environment with friends and families with their children. These picnics usually combined with boating, canoeing, swimming, and hiking and fishing. The cool breezes of the lake provided respite from the heat of the summer. In the autumn, the lake and mountains and streams continued to provide a natural playground with hiking, fishing, mountaineering, and hunting. 1892 gives our first record of sports structures specifically intended to attract tourists to this area. The minor mentions 4 fishing shacks built at various places along the lake and occasionally names groups of hunters and fishermen using these tourist facilities. And with the cold and the snow, Nelson converted to a winter wonderland of play. Families and friends, old and young, glided along on skates on the frozen lake. At times, the lake was as smooth as glass. Speed skating races to Proctor and back were popular. Barrel jumping thrilled the young and agile. Shinny games, the forerunner to hockey, gave athletes a team sport. The annual Christmas turkey shoot down by the lake gave marksmen enjoyment. Through the snowy countryside and mountains, hiking and mountaineering were replaced with snowshoeing and the new ski touring brought to us by the Scandinavian settlers. In town, up on the snow-covered hills, Stanley Street reigned, with toboggans, sleds, and flexible flyers hurtling down. By December 1892, an article in the Miner pointed out the need for the first community sports structure. A toboggan slide needed to be constructed for the children. This had become necessary to ensure the health of local pedestrians who were often in unfortunate collision with these speeding sleds. From continuing reports of sledding accidents, we assumed that this was not done, and in 1898 the first sports law in Nelson came into effect, prohibiting sledding on city sidewalks. In 1895, the frozen wreck grounds became a skating rink, and in 1896 the first recorded curling matches were held here. Kaslo was the opposing team. By 1898, Nelson had 3 indoor ice rinks, the Crystal Rink, the Arcade Rink, and the Nelson Ice Rink. In 1899, we hosted the first hockey championships of the Kootenay. Nearing the end of the century, in 1898, winter sports were culminated with regional playoffs and celebrations, and Nelson, being situated on the lake, often became the victim of nature's frequent winter thaws and was therefore an unreliable host for winter events. Thus, we became guests of Roslyn at their winter carnivals. By 1898, sports competitions included hockey, curling, fancy skating, speed skating, ski jumping, and cross-country ski racing, which was then called ski running. During the mid-1890s, the town settled in. Prosperity continued. By now, Nelson has 4 newspapers, 2 daily and 2 weekly, with regular columns providing information on various activities from surrounding communities. By now, our hotels reported as guests the social elite en route to trophy hunts in the area. 1894 was a solid year for the establishment of sports in Nelson, though Dominion Day that year had suffered in attendance as a result of the previous month's flood. It does provide our first record of a baseball game, our first recorded team sport, with the Colville team as our guests. Our Labor Day celebration began with a meager closing of government offices in 1895, but grew steadily to become a full-fledged affair, eventually to be shared with Sandon and Rossland by the end of the decade. Eventually, entrepreneurs took advantage of our annual celebrations and organized independent wrestling and boxing matches. After discreetly renting a hall, they would capitalize on the crowds already drawn. Only a few days before the celebration, saturation advertising would begin through postering and newspaper ads. Gambling was abundant. Large purses were offered. Traveling champions challenged our local athletes. These matches were the first sports organized by entrepreneurs for their own individual profit. In 1895, the first bicycle arrived in Nelson, and within 4 years had become a craze. Soon, newspaper reports of cycling accidents with pedestrians necessitated the second sports law enacted by the city. May 1899, bicycles restricted to 8 miles an hour. August 1896 witnessed the opening of the Nelson Tennis Club, holding a tournament the week following its opening. In April 1896, the Nelson Boating Club formed, and by summer the boathouse had been built. For its first regatta in August 1897, the events were 4-oared races, single scull with in-rigged and out-rigged boats, double sculls with lady coxswains, single, double, and 4-paddle canoe races, sailing canoe races, and a 50-yard swimming race. In 1898, they built their own wharf and were involved in inter-club matches, playing cricket against the cricket club. By 1899, they were involved in international rowing competitions. In spring 1897, the Nelson Athletic Association forms for the promotion of amateur sports, with baseball, field lacrosse, and cricket clubs becoming members. It is at this first meeting that lacrosse is acknowledged as Canada's national sport. In 1898, there is record of these clubs now organizing to form leagues. Presumably, this Nelson Athletic Association is the regrouping of the 1892 Amateur Athletic Club and the 1894 Nelson Amateur Athletic Association, and possibly even the 1890 Athletic and Glee Club. More athletic grounds are needed, and the association desires to establish them by July 1st. Unfortunately, the CPR produced years of red tape delaying acquisition of the grounds at Hall and Front Street, which are in use today. In 1896, BC's first hydroelectric plant opened on Cottonwood Creek, and our first smelter was erected in the Rosemont area. Within a few short years, the newspaper constantly complained of air pollution. Bailey Groman, a renowned sportsman and big game hunter, soon became our first known conservationist. He decried the potential ecological threat to the survival of fish and game by mining and logging techniques. He also decried the piggish taking of game by men in these mining and logging camps. Now comes the birth of the Kootenays in terms of an expanding regional sports consciousness. By the end of the century, many towns were firmly established along the lakeshore and rail lines. Kaslo, New Denver, Silverton, Sandon, Rossland, Golden, Ainsworth, Trail, Phoenix, Weimar, Greenwood, Newport, Bonners Ferry, and Spokane. The final rail link at the Crow's Nest was completed, providing transportation routes for sports tours. The telegraph was established, facilitating quick communications between towns, whereby games could be quickly organized or reorganized if bad weather threatened. By 1897, hose reel teams were secured as sports favorites at summertime celebrations visiting our neighbor communities. Each community offered tempting prizes, trying to secure each town's participation, the winners receiving large prizes, often cash, at these events. Towards the end of the decade, there is some evidence of the level of women's involvement. In 1898, the newspaper ran a sports corset ad featuring drill clubs and suggesting the corset's flexibility would allow golf, bicycle riding, and horseback riding, though how many women were participating in these is not clear. We also have no evidence of any golf occurring here yet. In 1899, the Women's Physical Culture Club performed drills organized through the Methodist Church. The Boat Club in 1897 has women's rowing events. We also know women are involved in playing tennis. Mixed doubles tournaments are recorded. And we suspect that women were involved in lawn bowling too. As yet, we see no women's names on the organizing committees, and from the physically cumbersome and restrictive dress styles of that time, we suspect that a lot of other types of sports involvement was limited once women reached adulthood. Economic gaps in society became evident through children's sports, and here we note another sports Samaritan, Charlie Waterman. Along with Jakey Dover, he organized the first Children's Sports Day and raised $100 for prizes and games for those Nelson children unable to attend the Kaslo Queen's birthday. Charlie was known throughout town for his special relationship with children. He encouraged their participation in sports at the annual celebrations by giving them nickels. Now older children began moving into junior categories of adult sports. The first mention of junior teams occurred in 1898 with boys football and in 1899 with junior hockey. The same year as their formation, these teams played in competition against other towns and regions. Marksmanship skill development was provided through the Nelson Rod and Gun Club, formed in 1900. Poor weather was often responsible for preventing large gatherings, particularly in the autumn and winter seasons. However, by the end of the century, there was a significant number of larger sports structures, whereby a number of non-seasonal indoor sports were solidly established. There was a covered grandstand, a bowling alley, there was a gymnasium in the basement of the Opera House, a gymnasium was proposed as an addition to the fire hall, the Hume Hotel had an auditorium in its basement, and the Fair Hotel was excavating, adding a basement to house its already long-established billiards room. Vernon Street Hall provided a space for wrestling matches. The financial base of sports began changing with the larger population and an established monetary foundation. Larger spaces, such as halls and arenas, made it possible for sporting events to draw larger crowds. These spectators began paying, with the profits going to the landlords, and within a few decades to the athletes and coaches and managers. Some sports now have several teams, such as football and hockey with their junior and men's teams. Team uniforms were becoming common. The foundation of sports as business was laid. The first athletes to sign a financial contract to play, possibly even the first in Canada, were Lester and Frank Patrick in 1909 during their last year of residence here. The town's attitude towards sports was becoming more expansive, indicating a consciousness towards quality use of leisure time. For example, in 1899, Charles St. Barbie proposed a major sports complex for Nelson, spreading over 40 to 50 acres. This complex would include a golf course, a racetrack, 6 tennis courts, and separate playing fields for baseball, lacrosse, and cricket. The plan even included a tramway system to transport athletes and spectators. In 1909, the YMCA building was erected, housing a small gym, a swimming pool, and a games room. In 1935, with the Civic Center, Nelson became the first such municipality on the continent to build a center of its kind. The move onward into the 20th century carried sports to the international level, and we benefit through film and television. Technology has brought us power and complex machinery, tools, and advanced sports gear. It has provided for ski lifts, for snowmobiles, and power boats for water skiing. Insulation and ice making gave us the Civic Center with year-round ice. Bulldozers have made the development of golf courses easier, and laminates, rubbers, and plastics and alloys have improved skis, golf clubs, and even running shoes. Our 20th century athletes now reap the benefits of these developments and the contributions of our sports pioneers.